everybody. Welcome everybody out there on Facebook. My name is Erica Ferriston. I am the Director and Co-Chair of Healthcare for All Los Angeles, along with Maureen Cruz and Betty Dumas-Toto. And we are so excited to have everybody tuning in for our speaker series tonight. Our mission, well, actually, we are a local chapter of a statewide organization, Healthcare for All California. We are an all-volunteer organization, and our Healthcare for All California mission statement is, we are dedicated to achieving a universal healthcare system through single-payer public financing. Our goal is that all California residents have comprehensive, high-quality healthcare. And the sole purpose of our organization shall be to promote comprehensive, universal healthcare using a single-payer public finance mechanism. So as Betty likes to say, we are single-minded for single payer. And tonight for our speaker series, I am so honored to have with us two members of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles talking to us tonight about medical apartheid, and to bring this to the forefront of the single payer movement's consciousness, so that as we fight to bring healthcare for all, we also fight to end medical apartheid, which is systemic white supremacist violence. This has been inflicted on our Indigenous, our Black, and our Latinx brothers and sisters since this country's beginning, and it is time to end it now. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Akili, who is affectionately known to many as Baba Akili. He has over 48 years of experience as a labor, community organizer, and political leader. Akili has dedicated his life to social and racial justice, and he has three basic beliefs. Number one, people make a difference if you go to them and seek to get them involved. Number two, the essence of democracy is inclusion and participation. And number three, we live in the richest country in the world. We can have a just, fair, and equitable society. He is currently director of the Fannie Lou Hamer Institute, and everything else that he does is like 2 pages. So I'm gonna leave it there, with as well as he is an organizer, a member of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And we also have with us Dr. Emilee Bargoma. She holds a Ph.D. in cellular and molecular biology and a master's in biology microbiology. Woo. She left her work at JPL NASA's Biotechnology and Planetary Protection Program to dedicate her time to studying diseases that predominantly affect individuals of African descent. She has performed and/or published referenced work on gene editing mutations and acute vaso-occlusion. Did I say that right, doctor? Okay, I'm getting that. Crisis in sickle cell disease. During her time at City of Hope, a national cancer center, she created and formed the institution's Sickle Cell Disease Forum. The forum aims to bring together patients, patient families, and advocates, healthcare professionals, and research scientists, all under one roof, to discuss the importance of adequate medical and research provisions for sickle cell patients. Currently, Emilee is investigating the induction effects of new target drugs on primary human cell lines. Her ultimate goal is to expand the library of available human cells to include African descent lines for a more accurate assessment of how these novel drugs perform in Black cell lines. So with that.
And they said, damn. I'm serious.
Oh, that's incredible, Dr. Bargoma. Thank you both so much for being here. Akili, would you like to open it up with the clip that you sent?
Please do.
All right, so Hanai, could you roll the clip, please?
I most definitely can. And can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful.
Everyone, please mute yourself.
Of Central Park in Manhattan. There's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to it when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
Well, what does it mean when you say that someone doesn't feel pain? Among other things, you're speaking about their humanity. These are all part of that suite of beliefs emanating from the 19th century that we still have not shaken off, despite all our knowledge and sophistication. They're deeply ingrained.
Doctors like Sims might fit the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, but they weren't outliers. Historically, Southern doctors who used Black bodies for troubling experiments were the norm.
It's a very common question. How can we judge our forebears? You know, those guys in the 18th century who practiced medicine in a way that appalls us today. You know, we think, how could you do that? I did not judge the practitioners based on our own ethics. I judged them based on the ethics of their time. It was not acceptable back then. We just did not hear from the people who protested against it.
After the Civil War ended, the 1900s brought a wave of immigrants to the US. It sparked a race panic and coincided with the birth of the American eugenics movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Leaders included birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project, or family planning centers that pushed birth control in the Black South. It was a project that even garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who wrote that Black people bred carelessly and disastrously. By the mid-1930s, more than half the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In 1961, future civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed, but was subjected to a hysterectomy without consent. The procedure, which rendered women infertile without their knowledge, was so common in the South that Hamer is said to have dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy.
African-American babies were no longer economically valuable. And African-Americans themselves had gone from being a resource to a nuisance.
In June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds in Alabama. Half the women were Black. In recent decades, women of color continue to be exposed to dubious reproductive health programs. In December 1990, the FDA approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marketed to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools.
You know, one of the current birth control methods now in the United States is Norplant.
Norplant fans like David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, even introduced legislation to give women on welfare an annual reward of $100 if they agreed to get Norplant.
And it's time we start to encourage welfare mothers to be responsible.
That bill never passed, but the implant ignited a debate on whether long-term contraception, like Norplant that lasted 5 years, could be used as a form of social engineering when pushed to specific communities. Today, as we continue to lose Black mothers at alarming rates, a deeper look at the past may be a good step towards creating a more equitable healthcare system. Hi guys, thanks for watching. Of course, there's a lot more to the history of how the US medical system has mistreated people of color than we could fit in the video. Everything from the Tuskegee experiments to Jim Crow laws segregating hospitals. But we hope it starts to give some context to the racial disparities we see in medicine today. ProPublica has been reporting on the disparities in maternal mortality in the US and how it's the most dangerous industrialized country in which to give birth. Check out that feature piece in the link below. And we're seeking your help in understanding the problem. So if you nearly died during pregnancy or you know someone who died due to childbirth-related complications, then check out that link in the description. Thanks again.
You and Akili and Dr. Bargoma.
Well, thank you. You know, I see that and have seen that video many times, which is why I recommended it, because it is connected to the Say Her Name article that was written. And for me, it started with first my personal outrage after I saw Dr. Moore, who was a patient in an Indiana hospital, and her video of herself and how she was treated was outrageous, was angered me. And I felt that was, and she died. She died insisting that the pain was unbearable. She died insisting that she needed more attention. She died listing the same kinds of conditions that you saw in that video. And so I, kind of went and started a stream of consciousness to vent my outrage. Luckily, I knew and believe in and admire Emilee, and I said, and I sent it to her, and she made sense of it, and she made it more than just a stream of consciousness. She took it and connected it to the apartheid that exists here, and I am, forever thankful for her willingness to do that. It would have set as a stream of consciousness had she not stepped in and made it make sense. But it is an example of the kind of apartheid that has existed here. And I want to raise something that I hear a lot in the medical community: do no harm. That is supposedly the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm. But you can see the harm that was done. You can see how enslaved people were thought of and treated. You can see immeasurable harm being done to people and being done now. And so to say her name, because Dr. Moore has become one of our honored ancestors, and what we do at Black Lives Matters is when we start off all our programs, we ground ourselves in those who have gone before us and who were forcefully taken from us or who have died but have contributed to us. And we say their names. And so this was my opportunity and our opportunity to say her name and to at least carry on what she started. And so with that, I want to turn over to one other thing. Many of you know that I have been a supporter and a participant of the single payer movement in the 80s and 90s. So this is, I have been doing this for a minute, but one of the things that I'm grateful was during that period, I got a chance to be in touch with healthcare workers from Canada, because we looked at their model. And one of the things that they told me about, that we talked about a lot, was their struggle in how to deal with First Nation peoples, and the constant need for engaging, involving, and changing to include the interests, concerns, and conditions of First Nations people. And it was a constant struggle. It was an uncomfortable struggle. It was an ugly struggle that they admitted to. And this is in the 80s and 90s when I did this work. And particularly for the many of the people of color that came over that I worked with here in California on the single payer initiative, but on the single payer program. They talked about it. They talked about their struggles, and they talked about the ugliness of it too. So I want to raise that, because as we move forward on healthcare for all, as we move forward on the demand for single payer system and Medicare for all, we must build into it the equity and the justice that goes along with it. I want to turn it over now to Sister Emilee to share with you her brilliance, to share with you her insightfulness, to share with you what she did in terms of making this Say Her Name remembering of Dr. Moore, and why it's important that we do this. So Emilee, I am going to just let you talk, ask you to talk now and share. And once again, say, I'm so glad just to even be in your presence. You hear me? So Emilee, please.
Thank you, Baba Akili, and Ashe for all that you do for our people and for the beautiful struggle. Can everybody hear me? So the story of Dr. Moore conjured so many emotions in me that like they all happened at the same time. And this video, if you haven't watched it, I really think everybody should watch this video. It was anger, sadness, frustration, and a sense of helplessness. And I think I dwelled in the helplessness for a while. And the reason for that was because of just this idea of watching a scientist, a doctor, who not only knew the human body, who not only understood Western medicine, but she could not even use that to help herself. And she was denied that. And this woman recorded her final days in the hospital from a disease that I'm pretty sure she helped a lot of people recover from. And that same humanity and courtesy was not afforded her. So for a while, I just felt helpless and just did not know what to do and what kind of outlet I could use, what venue would be a good outlet for me to get this, just the sense of helplessness out. I felt like I needed to do something. And it was just a spiritual thing, I believe, because the next thing I knew, there was a text to me from Baba Akili asking me to just read over an article he had written. And I open it up and it's Dr. Susan Moore saying her name. So of course that gave me the venue. That was the venue I needed to actually stress the importance of medical apartheid. And if you haven't read Harriet Washington's book, you need to read it. It is a powerful book. Now, when we talk about apartheid, it's always in reference to what happened in, and it really is still happening in South Africa. But in the context in which Dr. Washington used it, it was to pretty much lay out the history of medical and experimental exploitation on Black people in America, from the colonial times all the way to like present. I think her book was published in 2007. And in that book, she just tells you the history of how enslaved Africans had been used as objects, as entities for freak science to be done, because a lot of these Africans that were brought to America, they already had been doing scientific experiments. They were already physicians. They were, in fact, in Uganda, was where C-section, as we know it now, of course it's been modernized, came from Uganda. Ugandans had been performing C-sections long before Dr. Sims came into the picture. Of course, historically, we are not a written history people. A lot of our communication and passing down of historical information is orally, verbally. So because of that, and because we live in a world where white is king, so whoever writes the history gets to tell the story, to narrate the story and tell you where things come from. When in reality, a lot of the first things that have existed in Africa first. And these things were also being performed, including C-sections, by enslaved Africans in America, because their children were being forced to get pregnant. And this was how a slave owner would have even more slaves, by forcing these very young women, girls, to get pregnant. So a lot of them could not, of course, deliver because they were too young. They were not developed enough. So these enslaved, the enslaved ancestors were already performing these things that were then stolen from them and amped up and were being used really as torture devices more than actually trying to understand how the human body worked. So a lot of things, including scientific experiments, medical procedures, those were all practiced and optimized without anesthesia, because going back to what was mentioned in the video, there was this sense that Black people just did not have pain, or they have a high pain threshold. And what was interesting to me about this video, and I've watched this several times, is they talk about it in the context of history or the past. This is something that has happened in the past. This is something that is going on now. As I'm talking to you, I have my own personal anecdote of a doctor telling me that my fibroids could only be taken out by a hysterectomy. And I was 22 years old. But because I managed to put together the resources to go to a private surgeon, he looked at the same imaging data that was taken for me from my uterus, and with those images, without having his own done, told me that there was absolutely no reason for me to have a hysterectomy. And my story is just one of many where women continue to experience these things, specifically women of color, especially brown and Black women and Native American women. We are still being used as modes or figures for experimentation, for sterilization, so that the population does not continue. And these are things that are important for us to talk about, and to talk about it without fear of being labeled as being problematic or being extremist. Because if we stay silent, we will be wiped out. I am completely convinced of this. And this is part of my advocacy as a scientist. Medications don't work in a lot of people of African descent, Latin descent, Native Americans, because sometimes these experiments are done in Caucasian or European American cell lines. If you carry out an experiment and you optimize it in a single race, and the cell lines coming from a single race, you miss out on a lot of other things. So what you might deem to be efficacious in 70% of the population is not going to be so when you actually start distributing and administering it to the actual population, because you are going to have Black people with hypertension. You are going to have Black people with diabetes. You are going to have Native Americans with heart conditions, and they're using medications that were not optimized or designed using cell lines that were representative. So as a result, things are not going to be as effective. People are still going to say, I am in pain, and a doctor is going to look at them and say, well, no, you can't be. The dose that we're giving you is effective. We know that this is the dose that works in patients. So you must be lying. You must be here for not pain management, but you're seeking narcotics. This is a story that continues to exist today. It is part of the reason why I started the Sickle Cell Forum at the City of Hope, so that I could bring both physicians, scientists, and advocates and patients under the same roof, so that a conversation could be had about the biases that exist, these implicit biases that exist in healthcare professionals, in scientists, and other researchers, and how they decide whether someone is in pain, regardless of what the patient is telling them. And they err on the side of the patient being there for drugs if the patient is African American or Native American or of Latin or Hispanic descent. So these are biases that exist, and these are biases that need to be rooted out so that we can get on with the business of actually living the lives and pursuing the dreams that we have for ourselves and for our families. You cannot do that if you are afraid of going to the hospital. You cannot do that if you are afraid of what your body might be used for. There are African Americans that will have stories of what their grandfathers or what their loved ones, what they went through with the Tuskegee experiment. So these are not past. This wasn't decades ago. These are things that happened very recently where a lot of these people are still alive. These are things that are happening now with people that go to the hospitals. Sickle cell patients, once they are 18 years old, their sickle cell completely worsens because they are not receiving the care that they deserve and that the care that they should demand for without being considered combative. And part of my advocacy also is to encourage people of color to demand their needs and to express it to these healthcare professionals without fear or without intimidation. And sometimes when you do that, then you actually might get somebody in the health care profession or in the office that will actually stand up for you and advocate for you when they are communicating on their own or in private. So sitting quietly and allowing them to tell you what is wrong with you, what pain it is you may or may not be experiencing is really detrimental, at least for now, until we reimagine medical education, until we actually expose all these implicit biases that are in the educators that train future healthcare professionals, until we actually have just open and honest discussion and dialogue about the continued exploitation of Black people. We feel pain at the same level that everybody else does, sometimes even more so because you're getting it from different angles every day. And these are conversations that I believe needs to be had. I don't know if you guys heard the news today that we've crossed over the threshold of 500,000 souls that have been lost to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the most advanced country in the world that supposedly has the most advanced and current technology for medicine, we make up, I think now, almost 11% of the number of COVID individuals that have died from this virus. So this is definitely a much needed conversation. And my goal is to minimize or to contribute to reducing the number of Dr. Susan Moores that we continue to have or see every single day in this country. That is unnecessary waste of intellect, intelligence, the ability to affect change, both in the medical field and in her own personal life. We lost all of that. The medical system turned this brilliant woman into an ancestor long before it was her time.
And you know, this is much like I mentioned to you about the uncomfortable and ugly conversations that I had with healthcare professionals in Canada about their First Nation problem, but they had it. And they now, in many cases, are still having it. So one of the things I want to do as we move toward trying to address some of your responses is we do have a set of recommendations that we talked about. Firstly, we must be prepared to loudly disrupt the system and demand open acknowledgement of the stark duality that exists in this country's medical care system. That's one of the first things we got to do, that we can't be silent anymore. Secondly, the teaching practice of medical professions must undergo radical change. We must demand that Black participants are afforded the same level of care and consideration as whites. And then finally, we must demand that Black voices be at the center of every aspect of the healthcare system, starting with the call for single payer and Medicare for all. And because you all know that I have been an advocate for single payer and universal healthcare as a right, not a privilege, this is the center for me that continues to drive me. That yes, I support universal healthcare, but I also want to end the medical apartheid. I worked as the coordinator for the anti-apartheid, and helped cities divest from corporations. And it's that same approach that we used in the 80s and 90s, or 70s, 80s, and 90s to contribute to the people of South Africa ending apartheid. We are going to have to use today in ending the medical apartheid. But I think that it starts with first, acceptance and recognition, second, a call to action, and third, a willingness to take that action, engage, and make demands. And that's the difficult part, because it's much easier to, like to talk this stuff and go, well, we'll get around to it once we get single payer. We'll get around to it once once we have universal healthcare. But if we don't start now, once we get that, it'll still be the same problem. It'll still be the same issue. It'll still be the same Black people dying because of the anti-Blackness that exists. And so that's why I'm glad that Erica asked us to participate. I'm glad that we have a chance to share. And I'm glad that we are putting this forward in connection with healthcare as a right, not a privilege, with universal access and with Medicare for all. Because and my biggest concern, and I heard this from the people from up north, is that it wasn't a part of their establishment in the early 60s. And it took almost, if I remember correctly, they talked 20 to 30 years before they even began to pay attention to it with First Nations there. I don't want that to happen here, and it shouldn't happen here. As we fight to advance the universal healthcare as a right, we must also fight to advance ending the medical apartheid that is at the core, quite frankly, of private system. Now, this exists before the private system in many ways, but it's been aggravated by the private system. So I wanted to share that. I'm glad that we are willing to make this central in what we do, because there's been cases right here in California of women being sterilized without their consent. As a matter of fact, there was legislation that was just passed, 4 years ago? And those women haven't been, no apologies, no compensation, and no accountability. We cannot allow that to continue to happen. So as we, like I said, argue for and fight for and advance universal healthcare and Medicare for all, this has to be at the core of it.
Thank you so much, Akili and Dr. Bargoma, for bringing this to the forefront. And it is, my intention, at least in my fight for single payer movement, to have this be a core of it. And I'm here because of the two of you. And I'm here, when I hear Akili say, it's happening right here, of course, I'm reminded of the nurse, Miss Wooten, who revealed that women in the detention centers were having this happen to them. I'm reminded of Dr. Bargoma, when I heard you speak about sickle cell disease and how when children are diagnosed with it, they generally get decent care because they're going to the same place and have the same healthcare providers who know them and understand them. But once they are no longer children and can't go to where they've been going and have to just get healthcare wherever, this is, you know, where it becomes really problematic. So I'm also, you know, grateful. I was in a meeting earlier with Akili, and he talked about when we have movements, we need to know how we got here, why we're here, and what our demands are. And so tonight, by showing this film and having the two of you, it's helped waking up white people about how we got here. And maybe we'll start answering some questions when I hear people pass judgment on people who are weird or you know, concerned about the vaccine, concerned about getting the vaccine. And the other day I was at my post office and struck up a conversation with the postal worker who was working there. And, you know, she's a young Black woman, and she said that, you know, she wasn't sure about getting the vaccine because her feeling was she and I could go to the same facility and have the same doctor administer, you know, the shot, but she feels that she may not be getting the same thing I'm getting. This is how we got here to today with COVID-19 vaccines, this history. And when you understand that history, you understand what she's expressing and what she's concerned about. So thank you so much for being here. I believe we have some questions coming in from Facebook. So I'm gonna ask Jason Small to unmute. And if you want to-
Ask a question really quick before we hop over to Facebook.
Yes, you know.
So Dr. Bargoma, I just got to put a crown on your head for being getting through cell biology and micro and all that stuff, because I loved microbiology, but I'm glad it was only one course. There's no way I would get a degree in this. But you know, it's just, I mean, other than just being kind of lost for words, but I wanted to say, I worked at that hospital that Dr. Moore was at. I'm from Indiana. And I worked there when it first opened. IU North was a brand new, pretty facility. It's in the northern part of Indianapolis, a very affluent area called Carmel, kind of like our Beverly Hills type thing. And I didn't get hired on. I was a dialysis nurse, so I was contracted, token Black chick. And I would dialyze patients inside that facility, even though I wasn't staff, and because their staff was honestly mostly white. And so I could say that it is there because we just didn't have representation up there, even though it's a nice hospital. And yeah, I'm sure I actually see some of my old nursing school friends who are working there now, but back then, you know, and so to see that she was at IU North it was kind of just like, it was really heartbreaking because it was like, I wanted to be there. I have walked those hallways, and it's like, you want to save her, you know, like I wanted to be there, and I'm like getting emotional because that's what I felt. I wanted to save her, and it just wasn't fair. But anyway, sorry guys about that. When it comes to, like you said, doing the cell line studies, it's hard, you know, like to get people, you know, of color to do clinical trials because of this, right? Because we don't want to be experimented on. And I think one of the things I just saw was, of course, lisinopril in Black people and the angioedema. That's a big one. And it's like, how can we convince people like, okay, we need representation in these studies, but I also acknowledge and honor why you don't want to be in these studies, like the COVID-19 vaccine. You know, it's like, we need the representation because we need to know it works on us. I need to know it will work on me, but I understand why. So it's like, how can we in science get people like, you know, it's like we're needed, but how can we, you know, bridge this gap?
I think, of course, I don't have the answer, but I think part of the solution to this dilemma, it's historical. And as a scientist, I will never dismiss people's hesitation the pessimism that exists and just the distrust for the medical system. I completely understand. But I think part of the issue even begins with recruitment. An example I can give you was a physician, a Chinese American out of UCSF. He was a cardiologist, and he was getting stories from other physicians around San Francisco that more and more Chinese patients were developing cardiac or heart-related problems. But the research showed otherwise, that this was not happening. And so he did this little mini experiment where he sent out different recruiters. So, or when the patients would come to the hospital for a visit, he would have a particular type of recruiter that would go out to them. It was either a white recruiter, a Black recruiter, or Asian, or a mix of different races. And what they discovered was that they got more people interested in being recruited in this study. They got more Chinese Americans interested in this study if it was an Asian, and then even more people were recruited if it was a Chinese American specifically that approached them about recruitment. So that is evidence that representation truly matters. So a lot of the guards and the barriers that we automatically put up, I'm not gonna lie, when I look for things, if I want a therapist, if I want a general practitioner, I am going to look for a Black woman. Because you know that there are a lot of things that you wouldn't even have to explain. It's just going to be natural, and you feel safe that they really will have your best interest at heart. So this is why we need more people that look like these patients that come to these hospitals or go to these doctors' hospitals that need to be trained in these different fields. It's also important in the discussion room as far as when an experiment is being designed. You need to have diversity in there so that people can give input as to what is important and what should be considered in the experimental design. Because by doing so, then you account for a lot of these other things that you find out after the fact when it is at the doctor-patient level. So representation and input from jump.
And I want to talk about this because this fits into another area that I work in a lot, and that's reparations. And so acknowledgement, recognition, and accountability. That's important. Acknowledge that this has and is happening. Recognize the impact, and then take steps to make sure that people are held accountable. So it's the acknowledgement, recognition, and accountability. That is, if you want me to trust you, and your history is one of abuse, your history is one of hurt, your history is one of oppression, then you know I'm not going to trust you, quite frankly. But if we can acknowledge that history, if we can recognize the impact, and if we can be held accountable for it yesterday and today, then you got a chance of maybe me getting me to trust you. But without that, I'm not going to trust you. I'm gonna always question you. I'm always like, shit, any white people coming out, let them do that shit first. I ain't, you know, I mean, I'm looking at, I got my first shot and I'm finna get, can't wait to get my second, quite frankly, because I'm at that, I'm a senior, you know what I mean? I can't be taking no chances like that. But I have got pushback from folks, particularly people my age, that, hey, brother, you remember, you know about that Tuskegee shit, man, you get them, you know, and so, if we want to start developing that trust, then we need those three things: the acknowledgement, the recognition, and the accountability. You know, and I would add respect, because a lot of it grows out of the unwillingness to simply respect our humanity. What contributed to George Floyd's death was that officer was unwilling to accept George Floyd's humanity. what contributed to Dr. Moore's death was that the medical system and the people around her were unwilling to see her humanity. And that's what we have to struggle with, is that we have to be prepared to see our humanity. Because if you see our humanity, then maybe we can get to those other three. But if you don't see my humanity, what we got to talk about? I'm always going to be less than. I'm always going to be seen as problematic. I'm always going to be seen as a criminal. I'm always going to be seen as worse than. So it starts with, for me, recognizing our humanity, then acknowledgement, recognition, and accountability.
Thank you, Akili. Jason, could you give us one question off of Facebook, please?
Absolutely. Dr. Bargoma and Baba Akili, it's an honor to share the space with you. So I have a question from, and I'll probably mess this first name up, but from Mugega Cooper. And she asks, how does one deal with people who most times willingly deny that this even exists, despite the staggering evidence?
Well, that's why I think people in position have to come out with the recognition, with the acknowledgement, recognition, and accountability. You and I can say this all the time. It's like, well, these are good, decent white people, or these are good liberals, or these are good. It's them. So that's the first thing. But I also think that we have to be willing to accept the 4 conditions that Black people have to deal with: white supremacy, institutional racism, individual bigotry, and mass denial. It's that last one. And I hear it all the time, the last one. And here's a couple of them. I can't be racist because I played sports with Black people. I can't be racist because I got Black grandchildren. I can't be racist because I was in the military with Black folks. I can't be racist because I lived around Black people. I can't be, there's all these reasons why you can't be racist. And what you are doing is saying, my individualness, I'm a good person. But then if you look at the policies, if you look at the processes, in every indicator, we are either always at the bottom or always at the top. So infant mortality, we at the top. Access to healthcare, we at the bottom. That don't happen because good people like you who are not racist, how does that continue to happen? How is it that the police continue to kill us with no accountability if good people like you ain't racist? So part of what we have to do is attack this denial, this mass denial that we see. And one of the things that has happened is that with the killing and the murder of George Floyd, many people saw it and were outraged and disgusted by it. And the fact that people around the world demonstrated began to at least open the door. As Dr. Molina Abdullah says, there's a crack in the world right now. And so we got to be prepared to walk into it, where certainly some white people are waking up to, damn, you know what? This shit ain't right. There is institutional racism. We got to do something about it. That door, window, whatever is going to be closing real quick. And there's some people who will never accept it. There were some people who will blame us, who will say, you know what your problem is? You don't work hard enough. You know what your problem is? You don't stay up enough. You know what your problem is? You complain too much. You know what your problem is? There's some people who ain't gonna never believe that, and they will center their belief around the victim, around the Black pathology that exists, about our being lazy or our being gangsters or all the rest. And so they'll take the worst. That's the third one. The individual bigotry that goes on, willing to accept the worst stereotypes and then hold to that no matter what, even though there may be a few of us that slip through and make it, they're still holding them stereotypes, which reinforces the institutional racism. To say, see, I told you something was wrong with them people, which enforces the white supremacy. So we have to attack the mass denial that goes on. And we have to say that first, those other 3 exist, in the individual bigotry, the institutional racism, and the white supremacy, in order to deal with this. And that's what we, and I'm glad that there's a White People for Black Lives That's what your job is. You have to be the ones that educate other white people. You have to be the ones that say, wait a minute, that's a stereotype. That's not reality. You have to be the one to say, wait a minute, look at these figures, look at this study, look at this impact. It can't be that they all are like that. You know better than that. But that's going to have to come from good, decent white people to make that case.
Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Bargoma, did you want to add anything to that, or should I ask the next question?
No, 100%. I amplify everything that Baba Akili says. This is why he is my hero. Oh, can I say something really quick? Speaking of representation, so Jason, that name, you did mispronounce it. It is Mujige. And she just a few days ago launched the rover to Mars. So we are in the presence of excellence.
Yeah.
Yes, that's my good sister.
She
She asked that question that you asked brilliantly. You answered brilliantly, Akili.
Bless your heart. She actually has a second question for you, Dr. Morgay. May I ask that?
Wow.
She says, how do Black women in particular voice their concerns when being, and I believe you touched on some of this, but this is the question. How do Black women in particular voice their concerns when being seen by the doctor without being labeled aggressive while being denied care, as we saw recently in the case of Dr. Susan Moore?
I think the answer to that is really to be unapologetic. And if you push hard enough and you remain not aggressive, but you are assertive and you are firm with what kind of service it is that you want back from the physician or the nurse practitioner or whoever it is you're interacting with, you are going to see a change or an adjustment. It is also important to have someone advocate for you too. So don't just say, am I crazy? Maybe I'm exaggerating this, or maybe I'm taking it out of context. Actually have a sounding board. Have a discussion with somebody else and say, this is what I said. What do you think of that? Was that being too aggressive, or was that me being rude? And because a lot of the times when you are interacting with people, I've had people interrupt me and say, I feel attacked, or I feel that you are taking things out of context. So when that happens, there's a double consciousness that exists in Black people, Black women, when they are moving around in white circles or non-Black circles, because there is this thought of, am I taking this out of context? So I say, because of that existence of the double conscious, remain assertive and insist on what you want, and really just say to them, I want somebody else if you are not able to help me. One of the best advice that I got from one of my outside committee member, who is a Black woman, the dean of, I think the College of Molecular Biology at UCLA, she said, when you walk into a room, especially one that you know you are going to be put in your place, whether it's done outwardly or implicitly, you walk in with the audacity of a white man. And you say what you want to say, and you do not apologize for it. And it's worked for me.
One other thing I want to mention, and I think as we fight for Medicare for all and the single payer system, we are going to have to build in independent patient relationships patient advocates that can do this. Because even if we have access, but if we ain't taken seriously, or we are stereotyped or the rest, then without some place to go, and it has to be independent, and I know, Janine, I've heard you talk about this, but we have to build it into our demands for universal care, to build in independent patient advocates. So even, and certainly in a culture where men are accustomed to telling women, you know, we're the authority, you know, I went to school, I did this shit, you know, and you were just a housewife or you know, and we have ways of demeaning people and degrading people. So we have to build in to our fight for universal care, independent patient advocacy, independent patient investigation, and independent patient accountability, you know, doctor and healthcare professionals accountability.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason, for asking those questions. Dr. Ron Birnbaum, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I wanted to share a thought about representation and ask a question too. So but for background, I'm a physician and I'm Jewish and I'm a dermatologist. And my field has a significant problem with representation. It's sort of a worst case within medicine in a setting in which actually the melanin content of human skin is extremely important in the biology of human skin and its responses to different problems. So, but as a Jewish person, I also share something with the African-American community, which is that I'm also part of a people who has a legacy of being the subject of human experimentation. And but that now doesn't have the same iatrophobia and fear of that research apparatus. And I think part of that is our representation within medicine and science has been high. And so that I do think that that has to be an active area of, we just need more African Americans in medicine and science at the pipeline, at the beginning of the pipeline. No question. So sorry, that was just sort of a thing I wanted to say with the audacity of a white man, just say it. But then I also wanted to share an observation, and this is a question. So in addition to being a dermatologist, and right now I'm actually doing a lot, and so I've been sticking needles into people for a long time. And I'm right now doing a lot of vaccination for this. And I've been volunteering doing it a lot, and mostly in South Los Angeles. And so at risk of an overgeneralization, I want to suggest something that I believe to be true, which is that on the whole, Black people hate needles more than white people. I think somebody should probably study that question, not just whether I believe it to be true, but I actually believe the finding, if one were to study that, were to be true.
Well, all my kids do.
Yeah, and so
but I'm not prepared to go to make a generality about Black people.
Well, and I do so with trepidation, but because it's so important right now, that it makes me think that in my heart of hearts, I believe needles.
We can't hear you.
Hey, Ron, you lost your sound. Wait. Weird. You're not muted.
Look at it from your end. Are you muted at your end?
Is your jack plugged in? There you go.
Yeah, it is, but
there you go. We can hear you again.
You can hear me now.
Yeah.
I believe in my heart that needles hurt people, regardless of the color of their skin. But what I know too is that lack of trust, earned lack of trust, and fear, and anxiety, and maybe even anxiety that's transmitted from the way parents and children and doctors interact, may play a role in this. It's. I guess my question is like, how? I don't think it's an epigenetic phenomenon or something like that. How? You may not agree that this is a problem, but I think it is. But if you did, how did you think we should approach that?
Well, I want to let Emilee deal with that, but before she does, I want to speak up and speak out about the lone voice syndrome. We talk about representation, and we get one or two Black people in, and they do their best to raise their voice and to raise issues, but they become the lone voice.
Yeah.
They get down after a while, and they get tired of being the only, the Black person that got to be the, speak up. And too often, Black people are summed up as a group. And I tell this story about, if there was a red-headed white person, the two red-headed white people that worked at the same job, you wouldn't expect one of them to know where the other one is. But when Black folks, if the two of y'all work at the job, the assumption is y'all know each other. So when one of y'all late, they ask, where is? And so that lone voice syndrome, that you got to be the only person that raises the opposition. You got to be the only person that raises the question, where's the person down? And after time, it's like, damn, I'm tired of this. That's why there's a need for organizational support, organizational connection, organizational position, that when that lone voice speaks, that it's connected to, and it's connected to a broader setting, a broader group of us that say, wait a minute, if Emilee said this, y'all need to take a look at it. And so, so what you raise, that may or may not be a condition or a factor, but what I do know is that if you are the only Black person in an environment that can be as toxic as what we've seen and what we know about, and you start raising the question, two things happen. You get isolated and marginalized. And it means that your voice doesn't carry the weight that it should. And so that's why there's a need for organizational support, that people in these positions have to be connected to Black Lives Matter, has to be connected to the Black Nurses Association or something, because if it's just white-Black representation and we got a Black person in the room, y'all gonna wear that Black person down. Because the first thing happens is, well, it used to happen, it don't happen like this no more. Well, it's not a race issue. It's no, this is not the time for the race card. We all here want to see this progress. All those kind of rationales start floating up when you as a Black person start raising conditions about what's happening in the environment you're in. And so I want to speak up for ending the lone voice by connecting it to organizations, and that person being in that organization saying, wait a minute, you know what happened yesterday? These people, they just don't get it. We got to do something. And then as an organizer, I know, because movements have been made like this, the challenge, confrontation, and disruption if need be. So I want to raise that point, and then I want to let Emilee at least address I don't think that that's an issue at this point. I think that the phobia that many of us have towards shots is a kind of general thing, in part because we make it bad. The industry makes it bad, and it makes it bad. So I don't know if that's particularly applicable to us as Black folks, but I do know that even if you're the one Black person, and Gina, you have talked about this in your environment. You're the only Black person there. And every time you raise something, you get pushed back. Every time, not every time, but it's not always seen with the credibility, with the value that it needs to be seen in. So Emilee, maybe you can talk about the kind of discomfort that many of us have with needles and taking shots.
Thank you, Baba Akili. As usual, I love your boldness. I actually, what Baba Akili is talking about, this, the Nigerian author, Chimamanda Adichie, she calls it the danger of a single story. And it's on YouTube, you should check it out. But personally, I do think that there is some epigenetics behind that. Trauma can be generationally transmitted. So while at this moment we do not have enslaved Africans in America, well, I mean, slavery still exists, but the descendants of those enslaved Africans have in their DNA this trauma just that they have experienced since the beginning. And I think that there might be some connection. I've forgotten his name. It was he was invited to a Black Women for Wellness by Jan Robinson Flint. So she might know who he is, but he's a psychologist. And he talks about this fear of just being in the doctor's office. So even looking at seeing the needle before it's even taken anywhere near the patient, the Black patient, there is a reaction, a visceral reaction to it. And it's very difficult to not associate that to just the spirit of the ancestors that this now current modern individual has carried on, the trauma associated with that. So I'll leave it at that. So that's just my personal opinion.
And then Dr. Magruder, a sister that has written a book about the enslaved trauma syndrome that has existed, and she talks about it being passed down in our DNA and the rest. My mother was a nurse, and I remember how she talked about how, and she was a nurse in a segregated society. So her biggest accomplishment was part of the reason why we moved to Miami, because she could get a job in a white hospital. But how doctors frightened Black children, it was almost seen as a threat. If you don't act right, that's stuck. That's stuck. And that's not really the kind of things you need to be saying to children. If you don't act like we're going to go to the doctor and he's going to give you a shot. That's not the kind of thing you want to do. But that does stick with you. And so, that some of that kind of, that syndrome is still there. I want to give a quick shout out, by the way, before we end, to the Black Panther Party, because their work around sickle cell anemia, those free clinics open up the discussion, the process, and the dealing with sickle cell anemia. They don't get enough acknowledgement and credit for that, but that's one of the things that grew out of the uprisings in the 60s, the Black nationalism that shaped me, that helped me understand. It was what they did with those free clinics and they forced the medical institutions to deal with sickle cell anemia in a way that so I want to give that shout out to them, because it's appropriate, and too often we dismiss and forget those who have contributed to where we are now.
Okay, so this has been incredible. I know we've run a little bit over. I was going to ask Jason if he had any more questions on Facebook. Before I do, I just wanted to check. Would you be available to stay to take another question, or do you need to wrap this up? Stay to take another question, Dr. Bargoma?
Sure, yes.
Jason, do you have another question from Facebook? Okay, would you please ask that question?
Absolutely, yes. I have one last one from Leland Zhong, I believe, if I pronounce it like Carl Jung. He asks, what if white liberals feel they know more about racism than you do and can speak better about racism?
Yeah, and that's that's something I've had to deal with for over 50 years. White folks telling me more about being Black. I've been Black all my life. But what has happened, and one of the things, and I want to make a distinction, what has happened is we are constantly studied. You know what I mean? We are constantly referred to. And so there's a belief that study and those references and some of that research gives white folks an insight to us. It don't. It no more than the study and research that you do around, animals gives you to know what the animals, no, that doesn't give you a particular insight. Conditions create consciousness. And so our culture, our overall culture, not just and not just the elements of it, but our overall culture, both for whites and blacks, is very different. And so to assume, one of the things I do want to raise, this woman, Angela D'Angelo, written this book about being fragile, white fragility. One of the things she does do is raise an insight, if you will, in how white people deal with seeing us and understanding us. And I would simply ask that don't do that. No more than I, as a man, a black man, can assume I know about the conditions, factors, and impact of black women. I certainly can talk because it's been told to me and shared with me about the conditions, but I can't speak for, I can't be the voice for, and I can't be the interpreter of the conditions that black women are in. I can be a supporter, I can be an advocate, and I can be a conspirator, a co-conspirator with them. But it's them, that it's their voice that has to be listened to, understood, and accepted. And I think if we can convey to our good white brothers and sisters, we can do this. We know this. One of the reasons why Black Lives Matter is Black-led and ally-supported, because we know what we want. We know where we're going, and we know how to get it. We got enough history on our side to tell us that. You know what I mean? And certainly we're going to appreciate your support, your involvement, and your co-conspirators. But in the end, it's us, because we are the only people that can set ourselves free.
And just to add to that, when you come to any Black Lives Matter meeting or event, Baba Akili and Molina send those types to the White People for Black Lives.
Yes, I want to give a shout out for White People for Black Lives, for the white folks that are tuning in. We have to acknowledge, growing up in a white supremacist society, we may not even see how we are perpetuating racism. When I say we, I mean us liberal white people. And being an anti-racist is daily work. For me, I have found it with White People for Black Lives. And so that's awarela.org. And, it's just really, I was thinking about during the presidential candidacy, Marianne Williamson was the only presidential candidate who really talked about reparations and really had that on her platform and was loud about it and just right out there. And she used an analogy, but so I'm taking her analogy, but I'm applying it to, so, here we have our Black brothers and sisters, our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Indigenous brothers and sisters fighting racism. But the racism is being perpetuated not by the Black people, not by Latinx, not by Indigenous, but by white people. And so it is incumbent upon us to be in this fight, as Baba Akili said. And, it's as if, and this is Marianne Williamson's analogy, but if I was kicking somebody, it's not only incumbent on me to apologize, but I have to stop kicking that person. And then I have to help repair the wounds that I inflicted on that person. And then I have to do the work to look at myself and change my behavior. And so this is our job as white people. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Bargoma, thank you, Akili, thank you, Black Lives Matter. and particularly Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And so I will let the two of you close us out.
Well, I'll let Emilee. I've talked a lot. You know, I was talking to some people today. One of the things that being 72 does is people like shit. Okay, he old, let him talk. So sometimes I get carried away with that. You know what I mean? I just use the shit out of it. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna let Emilee close us out. And thank you all.
Baba Akili, I just love hearing you talk. So I could listen to you all day. I just wanted to say, so as a scientist, I do believe in the science behind COVID-19, the vaccine. So if you are, especially someone that's very skeptical of it, I am not a doctor, I'm not an MD, but I do the kind of research that was done to create this vaccine. And there's science behind it. It's unfortunate that it's been politicized, but the work on this was being done for a really long time, for many years, since I think 2015, led by Dr. Kiz-Nakia Corbett. So this vaccine is legit. When it's my turn to get it, I will get it. That's just my personal opinion. Not coming as a doctor or as a research scientist, but I think it's very important, especially people within the African-American community, because we are the ones that are most affected by this virus, and we fatally affected. We have among the highest rates of deaths, and for the ones that survive, there's so many other compounding issues that continue as a result, even after they've recovered from the virus itself. So it's important to consider getting this vaccine. And Erica, thank you so much for having me. This was amazing. Love being in the presence of allies that listen. And love you, Baba Akili.
It's so good to see you. And I'm always impressed just even to be around you. And please give your mother my regards. Tell her I ask about it.
She always asks about you.
Thank you both. Much love to you both. Thank you all for tuning in. And with that, good night.
Good night and thank you.
Good night.